the History Channel original podcast.
History This Week, November 16th, 1776. I'm Sally Helm. For months, George Washington's army has been fighting the British in New York City. And now, on the island of Manhattan, they have just one fort left. Fort Washington, named for George, is on what's roughly 184th Street today. American General Daniel Greene is convinced that he can hold the fort, but Washington himself has a bad feeling. As dawn breaks, Washington launches a boat from his encampment in Fort Lee, New Jersey, opposite Manhattan across the East River. He wants to assess the situation for himself, make sure that his namesake fort is well positioned for any potential attack. But before he's halfway there, the attack begins. When Washington finally makes it across, the situation is already dire. 8,000 British and hired Hessian forces are moving in fast against fewer than 3,000 Continental soldiers. Washington, fearing for his safety, retreats. He heads back across the river to New Jersey, leaving his army to repel the attack. The fort's cannons fire into a sea of red British uniforms, blasting holes in the enemy line. The king's forces charge in, with drums and oboes blaring. It's hand-to-hand combat. Fists, swords, bayonets. By 1 o'clock, every American soldier is barricaded inside the fort. Historians still debate whether it's true that Washington wept watching his men from across the river. But sometime after 3 p.m., he gets the news he feared. The fort that bears his name has fallen. This is likely Washington's greatest defeat of the war. The Continental Army is in tatters, sick, low on supplies. Some of the soldiers defending Fort Washington are as young as 15. The British reportedly laugh at their dirty, mismatched uniforms. And the Battle of Fort Washington is the latest in a line of defeats. An American victory in this war is looking like a very, very distant possibility. Washington writes to his brother, "I am wearied almost to death." Presenting that version of a founding father, of the American Revolution, a version that's messy, uncertain, for Ken Burns, that's what made the story worth telling.
I think the American Revolution is the most important event in world history since the birth of Christ. And it just changed it. Everybody before that moment is a subject, and a few people clinging to the eastern seaboard of the United States are citizens, a new thing, brand new thing in the world. That's a big deal.
Today, I talk with Ken Burns and his producing partner, Sarah Botstein, about the making of their new PBS documentary, The American Revolution. How did they go about revisiting a story that had been told so many times, it almost feels like a myth? And how does that myth fit into our world today? All right, Sarah Botstein and Ken Burns, welcome to History This Week.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
So you have noted in the past, Ken, that you and your team have not approached American history in chronological order. You have already covered the Civil War and the Vietnam War. I'm curious, why was it that you decided nearly a decade ago that it was time to turn to the American Revolution?
Well, we tell our stories chronologically, but we choose them in the most elemental way. You know, what hits your heart, what hits your gut, and make decisions based on that. And we were in the middle of finishing in December of 2015 our series, Sarah and I, on the history of the Vietnam War. And I just looked up with all conviction and said, we're doing revolution next.
What was that conviction? Where did it come from?
Well, I think it's got a built-in anxiety because there are no photographs and there's no newsreel.
Anxiety producing for a filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, I've dealt with a lot of stuff in the 18th century. In fact, our previous film was on Leonardo da Vinci, and that was 2 centuries before that in the 16th century. But there's something huge and mammoth about the American Revolution, and it's our story. And the problem is that the absence of photographs, obviously, and newsreel make our relationship to it a little distant. We don't want to touch the bloodiness, the hand-to-hand guerrilla fighting, civilians killing civilians aspect of our revolution. In part, I assume, maybe, that we're afraid that those big ideas in Philadelphia will be diminished, and they're not. They're only made more impressive by telling a much more accurate story, and that those people in buckles and hose and breeches and waistcoats and powdered wigs aren't any longer unfamiliar people to us. They are real and very much like us, filled with the same quantities of greed and generosity, venality and virtue that we find among our own populace and within individuals. That's the thing. It's not just white hat, black hat. These are struggles within individuals, and it isn't just the famous names. It's also a bottom-up story that involves Native Americans and Black Americans, enslaved and free, and Spanish and French and German and women is left out almost entirely from the revolution. This film is populated with women that are at the center of this story. Children as young as, there's a 10-year-old girl from Yorktown that we follow throughout the war. There's Abigail Adams, who may be amidst a crowd of really great writers, maybe the best writer of them all. There's a woman probably you haven't heard of, Mercy Otis Warren, who is a philosopher and historian of the revolution, who is a friend of Abigail's, but very much in the thick of the discussions about this that somehow get winnowed out of our standard histories of this period. And so we try to restore them, and it really helps if you've got Meryl Streep reading Mercy Otis Warren and you've got Claire Danes reading Abigail Adams to help them seem less inaccessible.
Yeah, it goes a long way getting over, I mean, as you say, the sort of buckled shoes and stockings problem. It really is a problem. We feel quite distant from those people.
There's a wonderful quote when John Adams, Abigail's husband, arrives in Philadelphia for the first time and describing how Philadelphia is laid out. It is so cute and wonderful, and anybody who's ever been anywhere near Philadelphia knows exactly what he's talking about. And yet here's a guy from the 18th century who's like, you know, some people don't like it. I do. And there's a kind of sense that there are real people involved in a story that we tend to turn into these, you know, statues, you know, out collecting pigeon, you know what, and not real human beings.
Sarah, let me ask you a bit about that, because it's so true that the revolution, it's so mythologized. It's really hard to believe it really happened. It's really hard to believe that it was contingent, that it could have gone a different way. I'm curious, Sarah, were there parts of it that you encountered that you felt, this is a part of it that I've never heard of, where you really felt that you were turning over new stones?
It's a great question. It goes to the heart of, I think, why telling history before photographs and newsreels and contemporaneous reports and living witnesses is hard. And to then go back to our origin story that is so wrapped in mythology and is kind of bloodless, and it's this complicated thing of big ideas when I don't think we even understand sort of culturally the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution, how long it took to go from one to the other. And then endlessly complicated, nearly decade-long, very bloody war. Fighting 18th century war is really, 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 really gory and awful and unmechanized and so far away. And then you want to, I think for us, find stories that our audience 250 years later can latch onto, which is a combination, as Ken was just talking about, getting to know the founders. I think Hamilton has been successful in some ways because it presents those founders as young, hip, energetic people you really want to get to know.
Right. Hamilton the musical. It takes a certain approach of putting these people in a totally different context so you see them afresh.
And one thing that it does is it reminds you that they were really young. Jefferson is in his early 30s when he writes the Declaration. Ben Franklin is an old, stodgy guy. He's in his 70s. Everyone's somehow like 30 to 45. George Washington is 43 when he takes, these are young people trying to figure stuff out. They weren't famous and the story wasn't told. And we use the word complicated all the time. It was complicated, but it was really surprising. It is so unlikely that we were going to win the war. And it was unlikely we were going to win the war for all kinds of reasons I don't remember being taught.
Ken, I want to pick up on something Sarah was just saying about the idea that the war might have been lost. We're actually going to be opening our episode with Washington's retreat from Manhattan. And that's a moment when it really feels like the Americans are on the brink of defeat. And it is so hard to remember that it was not a preordained outcome. What were some other moments where it really felt like the Americans were going to lose?
That's the revolution in a nutshell. So if you're at Lexington Green on April 19th, 1775, more than 250 years ago, the chances of success are zero, right? And it ebbs and falls. And I think the word that you used, Sally, earlier about contingency, this is what you have to do, is put people in good history, is watching because you think it might not turn out the way you know it does. So obviously the terrible mistake, strategic, tactical mistake that Washington makes at Long Island, leaving his left flank exposed, which causes the rolling up of his army. And if it isn't for the sort of hesitancy of General Howe and for a fortuitous rain and then a really fortuitous fog, maybe the whole thing is over right then. And then even after we've won a major battle, Washington not involved, he sent his best guys, Daniel Morgan, and one of his best generals, Benedict Arnold, to Saratoga, and they win, and they take a surrender of a British army, and the French say, yes, we're in, wholeheartedly. Even then, it doesn't seem, because there's a whole other series of battles, and Charleston is lost, and so it's really not until Cornwallis chooses Yorktown. It's not really until the French fleet finally arrives at the right place at the right time and engages, doesn't block the entrance of Chesapeake, but goes engages the British Army, that permits the big guns from the French fleet that have been in Newport to slip by and then up the James River so they can be, loaded at Williamsburg and then carried over for the siege of Yorktown. That you go, whoa, wow. All of this stuff. I mean, it's Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. You can be losing 10-0 in the bottom of the ninth inning if you're the home team with 2 outs and 2 strikes, and you can still win.
One thing that struck me watching excerpts from your film is that it really, really was a war of ideals. What were those ideals, and why was that so important?
Well, the ideals are expressed. Jefferson says, all experience has shown that mankind are disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. Meaning we choose this state of being under an authoritarian rule for all of human history. And we're actually inventing this new thing. We don't really know what it's about, but it's going to require virtue. It's going to require lifelong education. That's pursuit of happiness. It's going to require all this stuff that we're not even sure that anybody has the ability to do it. And we don't mean it for everybody. We mean it for us elite, the sort of Republican ideal of aristocracy, of talent, of landowners, white male. And all of a sudden, you've opened the doors. And even for, as Maggie Blackhawk, a scholar, says in our film, even for people at the margins, the Declaration is deeply significant because no one's ever said this before. And all in the buildup, the run-up to the war, people are talking about liberty. They're talking about freedom and the opposite of being slavery. And the people who are tending them and serving them, many of them enslaved people, are going, there's a choice that I can also have. And so despite the limited scope, and we always focus on how limited it was and what it means, this is big ideas being let out. It's the opposite of Pandora's box. It's not ills being released. It's great ideas into a world that has been suffering from the miasma of not big ideas. And the big ideas is that human beings can govern themselves. They do not need to be under an authoritarian rule. And that eventually, as vague as thank God, as vague as the language is, it's going to mean not just men, and as Jefferson meant, white men of property free of debt. It's going to mean everybody. And that cat is out of the bag, and everybody knows it at the time. The great historian Bernard Balin, who passed away before we finished our film, says on camera, before the revolution, slavery was not talked about. There were a few people, he said, who made an argument about how evil it was, but nobody talked about it. Once the revolution started, that's all anyone talked about.
When we return, we dive into the process, how Sarah and Ken decide what to keep, what to lose, and how to tell the story.
Ever feel like the internet is watching your every move? Like you Google how to fix my Wi-Fi and suddenly your feed is filled with routers and conspiracy theories? Same. There's a reason for this. Your browser is able to watch and store your digital activity, and that's why it thinks you're fascinated by routers. You can put an end to this using today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. As someone who spends hours researching all sorts of nerdy topics, I don't want trackers profiling me based on what I read. Surfshark encrypts my connection, so my data is safe, even when I'm digging into niche studies on public Wi-Fi at the library. It also unlocks content from around the world. I love watching documentaries that aren't available in my region, and Surfshark gives me that global pass. Even better, one Surfshark account secures all of my devices. That includes my laptop, tablet, and even my phone, where I record voice notes at 2 a.m. when ideas hit. An added bonus, Surfshark Alert tells me if my data shows up in a breach. It's like an early warning system for your identity. Secure your privacy with Surfshark. Go to surfshark.com/historythisweek or use code HistoryThisweek for 4 extra months of Surfshark. You'll find the URL and code in the show notes. And don't forget, it's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Protect your data. Explore the web securely.
Sarah, I'm going to put it to you. You mentioned the fact that Native people are an important part of this story. And it's a striking thing. At the beginning of your film, you turn to the Iroquois Confederacy and sort of make the comparison, point out the ways that sort of, there was a democratic society on this land before. That's so interesting to me. Why did you do that? Tell me about that choice.
Look, I think the Native American story is central to the American Revolution. That is another piece of this war that I don't think is as infused into the history that we're taught as it should be. And the Native populations, north to south, they split themselves during the war, whether they were going to side with the British or with the Patriots because of their history in the 7 Years' War. And that prologue, I think, works for a number of reasons. One is it talks about land. Land is important to this war, to the American Revolution, to the prize for North America, which everyone on the global stage was thinking about, right? Land. It's about democracy. Who is representing you? How do you solve problems? How does your government work? How does your community work? Who is in charge in your community? And how were the founders in America thinking about those things and understanding them?
That's exactly it. We had a scene about the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, a little bit later in episode 1, and I said, we got to move this to the beginning. If Franklin looks at this and goes, wow, we could do this too. That is to say, the 5 and then 6 nations that make up the Haudenosaunee. That is to say, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Oneida, and Mohawk. They have for centuries had a sort of democracy, a union of their separate nations that allowed a degree of autonomy within those nations, recognized borders, recognized independency and autonomy, but also had a kind of common defense against enemies. Franklin says, this is a great idea, right? And he convenes in Albany, New York, 7 of the 13 colonies, and they pass Albany Plan of Union. He does a picture of a snake cut into pieces representing the various states and says, join or die. It's 20 years before the revolution. Everybody goes back to their individual states to try to sell it, and nobody wants it. Not a single state wants to give up an ounce of autonomy. So it dies. But join or die becomes the war cry, as we say in the introduction, the prologue, in the greatest revolution in history, the most consequential revolution in history. So it seemed important to do that. So if you go into a school and you say, why did the revolution? Taxes and representation. Very, very true. Really important. But the number one thing, as Sarah is saying, is land. The prize of North America is great, except the North America is not there for the taking. It is 300 different nations, right? And so you've got people that have already been absorbed in the couple hundred years that we've been there and are living among and intermarried with and coexisting and not coexisting. And then on the western borders, you have lots of different native nations, as different and as important as, say, Virginia or France. And we tend to say them, but the Shawnee or the Cherokee or members of the Iroquois, say the Mohawk, they're as important a figure on the world global economy stage as Virginia is.
I want to turn and ask you a bit more about the filmmaking process. We've talked about how it takes a decade. We've already touched on some of the challenges with this war in particular. Ken, I'm curious, this is clearly a long process. The finished product is a long documentary. What are the first steps? When you first start approaching a new topic, what do you do?
It's really important to know that most processes begin with a set research period, 3 weeks, 3 months, whatever it is, followed by a set writing period, 3 weeks, 3 months, out of which is produced a script that looks like it's an inscribed tablet from Mount Sinai, and then it is shot and then edited. We never stop researching and we never stop writing. By the time we're done, we're on draft, 15 or 20. And a draft changes because you've marked it up and crossed it out so many times that you actually need a new draft in order to see and read the changes that you'd made before. And it is a process that goes over and over. It requires extraordinary patience and trusting to that process. We're reading, we're talking to scholars, we're interviewing them, we're filming, we're collecting archives, we're talking to reenactment groups, we're saying, yeah, we don't want you to reenact the Battle of Long Island or the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, but we want to film you and then use it as grist for our mill so that it's more impressionistic. What are the paintings? Can we film this extraordinary landscape from Maine to Georgia? What's happening there? Even Canada, because there's a failed invasion of Canada hoping to make it not the 51st, but the 14th state. There's just so much you have to collect. So it'd be understandable to think that this is an additive process, right? But it's actually subtractive. We collect, like I'm talking to you from New Hampshire, we make maple syrup here. It takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. And we have a shooting ratio of at least 40 to 1, maybe 50,
Wow.
maybe 60 to 1. And so what you're doing is if you boil it really easily and fast, you get rock candy. And that's like quick and dirty production. If you evaporate it, which is keeping the temperature just below boiling, then you get the elixir. And so Sarah and I and our colleagues have worked for years, nearly a decade, to try to distill all of that stuff. Stories that our cutting room floor is filled with unbelievable stories that you'd look at and go, whoa, what's wrong with you? Why isn't that in there? And they just didn't fit. And when we're in the last days of editing, it's basically me saying, open it up 2 frames. That's a 1/12 of a second. Close it up 2 frames. That's a 1/12 of a second. And it makes a difference across 12 hours, 6 episodes. And so the process is really long. It's exquisitely torturous. And also, there's nothing I know better than the love of my family than making a film better in a day. And you can walk in the next morning and go, what idiot thought that? Meaning me. And then start all over again. But somehow to figure something out, like, Sarah, we had this situation, we'd already locked, and we had for the year, the prologue and the introduction was running just the way it was. And I was on the Upper East Side of Manhattan at an appointment. Sarah was down in Lower Manhattan, and I called her and I said, I'm not happy. And she goes, with the introduction? I go, right. And within like maybe 20 minutes, we had blown both the prologue and the introduction up. which is like
editor really almost killed us, but it's okay. She recovered.
She recovered and then added extraordinary things to it. But we moved a quote that was in the middle of the introduction to before the prologue. We kept the prologue exactly as it was, but we had to protect it now because we had something in front of it.
What problem were you solving, Ken? What was it that made you sit up and say, we have to change this?
There was a didacticism in a couple of paragraphs, which we lost entirely. Like, we'll get there. We don't have to put everything into the introduction as if it's like, those old 19th century novels wherein Sally interviews Ken and Sarah, wherein Sarah discovers that, Ken is talking too much, right? Ken finally realizes it's time to shut up. I mean, we just were doing a little bit too much of that. And there was...
You were like, don't tell people what to think. I just like, let it unfold.
That's a real rule. We definitely follow that one.
We never want to tell people what to think, but we just had loaded it with just a little bit too, our cart was too full, and that it was okay to just have a more emotional thing. We even imported a quote, the back half of a quote that we had just recorded and put at the very end of the film, the next little last moment of the film, recorded Abigail Adams' quote to follow, not immediately, but to follow her husband John talking about, we're in the middle of a revolution. It's the biggest thing ever, and the lives of millions unborn are at stake, which is exactly right. And she's saying, you don't want to get into this overthrow of empire business too lightly because it's about blood. It's about sacrifice. It's really a bad business. And the American Revolution, as Sarah was saying, it's a bad business. A lot of killing is done with a bayonet, which is, let's not even go there, right? It's really, really, really bad. And so all of a sudden we had an energized and revitalized prologue, and it was one of the more glorious moments of this production.
We talked earlier in the conversation about the problem of not having archival footage, not having photographs. Is there a moment where you feel that you all solved that problem particularly well? Is there anything in the film that you're really proud of in terms of bringing this alive with the visual sources that you had?
We started, Buddy Squires, who's been working with Ken for literally almost 50 years.
51 years.
51 years, right?
Wow.
We really wrestled with, okay, are we going to shoot? We don't want to see people's faces. We don't want it to be hyper realistic. We want it to be somewhat impressionistic. And we don't want to be going from A to B in a script. We don't have the script with us whenever we're shooting. It's kind of an imagination. Let's see what will work. And so we started shooting through old glass and through smoke. And we would always have sometimes actually 2 drones along with Buddy on sticks, or Buddy dressed like one of the reenactors in the line with them, so that you could we wanted to be moving and feeling and have it be beautiful, but not too literal.
We had a total eclipse last year. Remember that? We got a beautiful scene on a total eclipse.
Yeah, you filmed that actual eclipse. It's amazing.
We did.
Yeah.
That was an insane shoot because you're dealing with time, space, and weather in a really fun way to make a movie.
So I take a walk every morning with my dog, Chester, 3 miles, and it's in an area that's little unchanged from the 18th century. So I took along my phone and maybe 40 images, maybe 35 images in the final film are off my phone and looks like the period. I mean, we're using much more professional equipment, but it was exciting and exhilarating because I go at dawn and it's atmospherics that are beautiful and they appear throughout the film. And I think also for me, we don't have Steven Spielberg's budgets, but there's some people with their hands over a fire and it's cold. And you know it's cold and you feel it's cold. Or you see just the shimmering heat at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, where men died of heat exhaustion. And then when the battle's over and the British have protected their supply wagon, so they left, and even though it's a draw, because they've left, we can claim it as a victory, and we do. The next thing you see are women and children's bare feet. Because you think of all of this as an utterly male, masculine exercise war, but women are accompanying this army, their children around there, and the first job after the battle is to go there and tend to the dead and tend to the wounded and to, and there are these little feet, women and children over the battlefield, and it's stunning.
Ken, as you mentioned, you've been doing this for a long time. You've been making these documentaries for over 40 years. And, you have a specific style, of course, that you've become quite known for, that you've retained over that time. At the same time, I'm curious because media has changed a lot over that time. People's attention spans have shortened. Are there ways that you feel like your style has evolved that are important to you? And what are the things that you feel it's important to be consistent about, to sort of never let go of?
So let's define a term. Style might be the authentic application of technique. You okay with that?
Sure.
Lots of ways to skin the cat, lots of ways to tell the story. So we haven't really changed. It's just each thing is an adaptation to the exigencies of that particular project. No photographs, no newsreels. In Vietnam and World War II, we could say no experts, just people who were there. That's it. Or waiting for somebody to come back. That's it. But you have to have experts here because there's no living witnesses. And while there may be a handful of first-person voices in World War II and even fewer in Vietnam, there's this whole film is first-person voices. Hundreds of them, personifying not just George Washington, but, Betsy Ambler, 10 years old in 1775 from Yorktown when the war begins. And all of a sudden, you're bringing in the new archives. You discover something new. You find a new quote. You record that. You bring Claire Danes back in to do that last Abigail Adams quote. You get somebody to read this. Somebody says, I go, I don't like that painting. Of I don't think that's a good Benedict Arnold. And then all of a sudden, after months and years we find a better Benedict Arnold, right? And so he's a really important character. He's not Benedict Arnold until our last episode. By episode 2, he's like one of the best generals. And so there's this constant working on it that we just love to get in there, and we're dedicated to making it better. No egos. The lowest intern has the right to say something and contribute just as the most senior producer does.
When we come back, what the American Revolution means now, in the same country, 250 years later. Sarah, this is a historical documentary, of course. From sort of a craft perspective, as you're putting things together, how, if at all, are you thinking about the present as you're making decisions about how to frame this information and what to put in?
So people have a hard time believing this, but we really don't.
Really?
We really do not. I shut the noise of the current moment out entirely when starting a project. Every film we make, I think the thing that keeps us up at night is just, do we get the story right? And does the film stand the test of time? And if it does that, then we're doing a good job. But what about now? Okay, you're going to find it's going to feel different 2 years from now. I'm telling you.
We'd rather expend a good thing than think that, oh, you put this in because of today.
There's a map of smallpox. If we hadn't had COVID, every kid's going to know what a map like that and think about inoculation and vaccines. Okay, but again, I think when it feels too much like that, we feel like, oh, something's not right.
Yeah, and we take it out.
And yet, the film does come out at a particular time. It happens to be coming out in the year 2025, and it's coming out in a really divided time. It's hard to imagine the country coming together for something as collaborative and huge as the Continental Congress. How do you think this story speaks to our moment?
Well, we've always been divided. That's what one of the aspects of the story will remind people. And in that alone, believe it or not, is a, what's the right word? It's something refreshing, Sally, to know that we have been this place before. The Civil War killed 700,000 people of our own. And Vietnam, which Sarah and I worked on for years and years, we've been divided. And so I think this possibilities of a good story sort of not disarming that division, but reminding us actually how close we are in the midst of that division, that many things that people say are dividing points, part of it is the internet, and I'm not sure that attention spans are done. People binge. My kids binge. They watch something for 28 hours. I've never made a 28-hour film. They'll just binge. So I just think people like cats playing with balls of yarn in 2 minutes, and that's great. And people also know that all meaning accrues in duration. So we've got a complicated story, and that I think when we started it, Barack Obama had, 13 months to go in his presidency. Now we're in a completely different place, and we feel a kind of existential threat. And maybe going back to an origin story permits you to reacquire the things that distinguished us in this most important moment in world history. That is to say, the creation of the United States of America. Does it have bad stuff? Is it violent? Yes, in the extreme to all of those stuff. But it has the very best ideas that human beings have come up with, and that the story of not just the United States, but of the world has been the continual expansion of that. The novelist Richard Powers says the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story. We're not into prescribing what that point of view is. We're just saying, look at this complicated story. It's possible now to disarm all of this binary, red state, blue state, I'm right, you're wrong. None of that binariness exists in nature or in human nature. There's a momentary humility that we all need to have in the midst of our certainty right now. Everybody's certain. My way or the highway. And what this tells you is it's so much more interesting and so much more complicated, and it's really beautiful too. It's ugly, it's brutal, it's horribly gory, but it's also really beautiful.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Sally, really great questions. Really wonderful.
Great questions.
Oh, thanks. The American Revolution is a 6-part, 12-hour documentary now premiering on PBS. The series is directed by Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and David P. Schmidt. It's also narrated by a guest from one of our recent episodes, Peter Coyote. Check it out. History This Week is a Back Pocket Studios production in partnership with the History Channel. To stay updated on all things History This Week, sign up at historythisweekpodcast.com. And if you have any thoughts or questions, send us an email at historythisweek@history.com. This episode was produced and sound designed by Ben Dickstein, and also produced by me, Sally Helm. For Back Pocket Studios, our executive producer is Ben Dickstein. From the History Channel, our executive producers are Eli Lehrer and Liv Fiddler. Don't forget to follow, rate, and review History This Week wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next week.